Welcome to Finding Solutions. I'm Dan Albus. I serve as the Member of Parliament for Okanagan Lake West, South Kelowna. And here on this podcast, we talk about people that are working hard in their communities to make them stronger and our country safer. Today, I'm delighted to have one of my parliamentary colleagues, the new member, I should say, as of 2025, for North Island Powell River, Gunn, who's well known in media circles for his great documentaries highlighting the military, highlighting drug addictions and government mishaps and policies. Aaron is very celebrated for his documentary work, but also he's a strong voice for the good people of North Island Powell River. I've gotten to know Aaron as he started out, and I have to say he's worked very hard as an MP, and we've worked together and collaborated on a number of committee work, such as BC Ferries. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Aaron. Thanks for being here on Finding Solutions.
Thank you for having me, Dan. It's always a pleasure to have a good, hearty conversation with you.
Well, that's excellent. So let's just start off with you. What is new and exciting for you and for your constituents? What are you working on?
Well, there's so many issues. I guess the big thing right at the start is, of course, I have a new portfolio that I'm looking after. So being named the Shadow Minister for Ethics and Accountable Government. And I put a funny poll up on my Instagram the other day asking followers if they think it'll be difficult for me to find cases of ethical lapses with this government, and there is near unanimity that it wouldn't be challenging to identify them, perhaps. But obviously, we want to expose and communicate it to as many Canadians as possible. This is a government over the past 10 years that's had ethical lapse after ethical lapse, as you know, through SNC-Lavalin, We Charity, Arrive Canap, the Safe Supply scandal, or so-called Safe Supply scandal, and now we have everything from the condo bailout to the many conflicts of interest of our current Prime Minister. So I'm sure we'll get into all that, but I would say that's really the big thing that's landed on my plate recently, and I'm sure will keep me very busy in the weeks and months ahead. And let me just say, in addition to thanking you for having me on your show, how I definitely wouldn't, my first year as a parliamentarian wouldn't have gone nearly as smoothly and productively without your guidance and counsel and support. So I very much appreciate it.
Well, that's very kind, Aaron. But anyway, it's always to help a colleague out, and you've been a great contributor in our caucus. So let's just talk about, though, pre-politics. So, you know, you've established yourself both in British Columbia and right across Canada as a producer of documentaries. What got you into that?
Well, so I think one place we can start is how I got into filmmaking. So I literally, going back to middle school, started making movies with my friends. And then once we got into high school, we had developed the skill set just out of fun and passion, and decided that rather than working at the local fast food restaurants like teenagers used to do, we would start our own film company. So me and two other friends started a little production company called DCMC Productions, and we started filming weddings and graduations and all that kind of stuff, and used that money to pay that was our first job, and then to pay our way through university. At the same time, I developed from a very young age a passion for politics, for fiscal responsibility, preserving our history, law and order, many of the core tenets of modern day conservatism. And at a certain point, first at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and then in 2017, when I started making videos with BC Proud and Canada Proud, I basically fused that skill set that I developed when we owned a small little video production company with friends with a passion for politics and fighting back on behalf of our country. And I started making at first very short videos, and then starting in 2020, longer documentaries, culminating in some of the ones that you mentioned that people have seen, like Vancouver is Dying and Canada is Dying. And of course, leading eventually to me running for office and being your colleague in the House of Commons.
Well, and again, it's knowing the issues and developing a voice, having something to say. Those are all things that are really important in public life. Being a champion for your communities, which, you know, I've gotten the chance to tour around North Island Powell River, and it's fantastic to see the reception you get, because you've really got your finger on the pulse with your constituents. Now, your first movie, you know, what was that? And maybe can you tell us what your evolution is? You know, why you chose that subject, and what's changed since you, if you were to look back at 2020 and that first film, What would you say to yourself today?
Yeah, well, the first thing to maybe point out is when I started out, unlike the CBC and much of the mainstream media, there's no massive government subsidies. So we were working on, especially season one, like the most ridiculous shoestring budgets you could imagine. And so we would film multiple what we call episodes of the series Politics Explained. They're kind of mini films at once. So I believe there was maybe 5 or 6 episodes in the first season. I believe the first one that we released was about, I don't remember what it was called, but it was about debunking the misconceptions that all First Nations don't oppose pipeline, that all First Nations don't oppose pipeline development. So we were actually up. I believe my first interview was up with another future colleague of ours, Ellis Ross, former chief of the Haisla Nation and former BC MLA. We were up through Burns Lake, through Smithers, that whole area. And basically chat, and as well as on the TMX route, so up by, I guess, just north of here in Valemont and around Blue River. There was an encampment protest going on at the time. So that was the first film that we did, and definitely the production value increased over the years. But I think the motivation behind the films and the commitment to powerful storytelling stayed the same. And one of the ways that I picked which topics to cover was choosing topics and angles and narratives that I thought were being ignored by the mainstream media and trying to bring voice to those issues, trying to bring common sense solutions to those issues. So there's obviously no greater example, I think, than the drug crisis, when the federal Liberals and provincial NDP decided it would be a good idea the solution to the addictions crisis was to hand out free drugs en masse across the population, to decriminalize hard drugs here in BC. And that's really when coincided with the release of Vancouver is Dying, and then Canada is Dying, which made quite the splash. So always trying to find that information gap or void where there wasn't, in my view, a proper nuanced debate or discussion happening about a very important public policy issue, and Canadians were being hurt as a consequence.
So when you did the Canada's Dying, so there's Vancouver's Dying, Canada's Dying, I believe there was a third film.
One, yeah.
Yes. So that really opened up, because I've seen them all, it opened up, to my eyes, a large debate that had been going through our society for quite a while, and it really exposed a lot of things. So maybe, could you just maybe synthesize for my listeners, what you saw over those videos or those films that you did, and what has changed since then?
Well, if we go back to Vancouver is Dying, which would have been released in the fall of 2022, I mean, the amount, I think people did not know what was happening. And I say that as I didn't know what was happening until I started filming the documentary. Everyone could see the effects of these policies. So homelessness exploding, property crime exploding, the connection between drug addiction and property crime, because people end up developing these addictions that are as much as $100 a day, $150 a day. Where are they going to get the money to fund that? So probably the biggest thing that we exposed, so the first thing was probably the connection between crime and out of control drug addiction. The next thing that we exposed was what I had never heard of at the time, called Safe Supply, later rebranded by the activists as Safer Supply, later rebranded when that became unpopular as Prescribed Alternatives, but essentially handing out a government supply of opioids for free, opioids that would end up getting diverted and resold. And I had never even heard of this until I was literally on the downtown east side with my camera guys, with a shotgun mic, and started asking homeless individuals about what life was like on the streets, how things had been getting worse, and they started bringing it up to me. And it became very apparent that individuals were getting these opioids, even though they were actually addicted to fentanyl, and instead of displacing the fentanyl and using these supposedly more safe opioids instead, which, by the way, are about 3 times more powerful than Oxycontin and pretty similar in potency to heroin, going around and reselling them or trading them to fentanyl. What that did is It basically flooded the market with these cheap opioid pills, which, of course, because of supply and demand, collapsed the price to as cheap as $1, $2 a pill. All of these cheap pills then ended up getting resold to people who were just starting out in their opioid addiction, people on university and college campuses, even on high schools. I interviewed a young woman who was as young as 15. There was a case of a 14-year-old, I believe, who overdosed and died in Vancouver on hydromorphone. And just trying to expose the fact that at the same time, the government was talking about how we needed to sue pharmaceutical companies for falsely labeling prescription opioids as reasonably safe and non-addictive while flooding the streets with them through the opioid crisis that everyone knows in Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Our own provincial government here in British Columbia was doing the exact same thing, except the drug was even more powerful, hydromorphone, brand name Dilaudid, handing it out for free, calling it safe supply, and watching as it created the next generation of addicts. A culmination with a number of other policies that's left more than 50,000 Canadians dead over the past 10 years. So that was probably the biggest revelation. Talking with addicts in recovery, who almost all told me the idea of this kind of unhinged, out-of-control harm reduction where you just gave people free drugs and a free place to stay was a complete disaster. Addicts telling me that if when they were on the streets, they were given free drugs by the government, they'd either still be on the streets or dead. And just this, the body of so much overwhelming evidence that what the government was doing was an abject failure and that people were dying as a result, and that the evidence was there, but the government was either willfully blind or for some other set of incentive reasons or ideological reasons we're deciding to push ahead with the suite of policies anyways.
Well, in the Okanagan, we've seen a real deterioration of, a cycle of homelessness, people with mental illness, chaos in terms of street disorder. It heavily affects the Kelowna downtown and part of Rutland. And we've had multiple town halls, and and even when I speak to individuals that are homeless or seeking shelter, they won't use some of the shelters because they're afraid of the drug use. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I raise this is because there are other options. And unfortunately, while government is funding some of these policies, there are options like Freedom Store. You and I visited there earlier today. Can you maybe talk a little about the mismatch of what you see in terms of an ideological approach and what Freedom Store is trying to do with people, and how because to me it makes no sense that we have people that are getting recovery, essentially an off-ramp from a life of addiction, and the people that are helping facilitate that Freedom Store is completely private donations. There's no government funding.
Yeah, it's incredible when you dig deep into this, the world of recovery, and maybe an adjacent world that I like to call the poverty industrial complex. You have many centers for recovery and rehabilitation from drug addiction that receive no government money at all, that have way better outcomes than other facilities that are completely dependent and almost exclusively dependent on government money. And a big part of that is if you sign up to receive government money in British Columbia, you basically have to abide by all of these crazy ideological rules that the BC government imposes upon you. You have to have what they might call wet beds, or you basically have to welcome people into your recovery house that are still actively using drugs. Which, of course, if you talk to abstinence-based recovery, which in my view is essentially the only form of to not be abstinent-based recovery, to me is almost an oxymoron. How are you in recovery if you're still using drugs? And that's the kind of ideological policies that the government pushes. And I think it goes back to, if you remember the narrative pushed by David Eby, Justin Trudeau. I don't know if we probably need to press Mark Carney a little bit more on this, but they kept talking about the need to destigmatize hard drug use. And I think that I was talking to Dr. Keith Humphreys, who's one of the top addiction physicians in the world, from Stanford, and he said we should be destigmatizing people getting in recovery, people that have overcome drug addiction. But the idea that you would want to destigmatize something as destructive, both to yourself, to your family, to your community, as using fentanyl, as using crystal meth, is crazy. And it reminds me back also to this saying that has stuck with me, and it was one when I was interviewing a business owner in London, Ontario, who had been and London, Ontario has been hit probably worse than any community outside of British Columbia, at least, as far as entire parts of the downtown core that have basically become no-go zones for citizens who live there because of safety issues and things like that. And this business was one of the ones that was affected. We had interviewed this business owner, and after the interview, the cameras had stopped rolling, unfortunately, but he had this line that stuck with me. He said, you get what you tolerate as a society. So you get what you tolerate as society. If you tolerate open-air drug use, if you tolerate property crime, if you tolerate shoplifting under $500, if you tolerate drug use and addiction in perpetuity, where there's no incentive to get clean, no disincentive from using drugs, then that is what you're going to get.
Yes.
And that is what we've gotten in Canada over the past 10 years, because that is what the public policies put in place by provincial and federal government have encouraged, enabled, and ultimately normalized.
Well, and this is what really gets me, Aaron, is that locally in Kelowna, the detox that was run by a not-for-profit, they've stopped doing it. And there's been no replacement for that. So groups like Freedom's Door are there to work with people to help give them that recovery. And it's not just a short-term program that people can, take and then they're back out. It's a considerable amount of time. 90 days, and then they have the Next Steps program that will go on for as long as they need to in some cases to make sure someone is ready, to re-embrace life. But again, if we're not giving people the basics like detox and instead giving them those kind of, you have to wonder what we are incentivizing. We're not giving money to the people that are abstinence-based approach so they can ramp it up. We're not funding detox, and yet here we are still giving people drugs.
But I think, and this isn't just on the drug file, we've seen over and over again with this provincial government and this federal government, if you don't toe and push their ideological line, there's basically no funding for you.
Yeah.
But if you are out there, it doesn't matter what you're delivering to the community or the country or the province, if you are pushing and amplifying the government's ideological narrative, there's basically this unlimited pot of money that will just continue to shower down upon you. Taxpayer money, of course. And I think there's no better example of that than these so-called nonprofits that they like to dress themselves up as, and that have no track record of success whatsoever. But if they echo and push the government's message on harm reduction, there seems to be an endless supply of funding. And then you've got amazing recovery places like the Last Store down in the Lower Mainland, and then the one here in Kelowna,
Freedom Store.
Freedom Store,
yes,
that do a fantastic job, have this track record over, in some cases, decades or more than 2 decades. And they don't even want the government money because they know what's successful, and they don't want to become corrupted by a government program.
Yeah, well, to me, again, it just, you said it earlier, is finding out what the issues are and then bringing some common sense to it. So one of the things I know that you're going to be tackling very soon in your new role, and again, congratulations as terms of being in the shadow cabinet, the Conservative shadow cabinet, and with the mandate to speak on behalf of ethics, is this bailout that is occurring in British Columbia. Could maybe you just give our viewers just a little bit of background as to, what Mark Carney and David Eby have been proposing and what the reaction has been to it?
Yeah, it's honestly in some ways difficult to comprehend. You have a situation in Vancouver, and I think it's so important to take a step back for a second to remember Vancouver has been identified as having the 5th most unaffordable housing market in the entire world. And you have a situation now where finally, at least with with condo units, the prices were starting to moderate and maybe starting to come down a little bit. And there is now a number of vacant condos on the market that aren't selling at the current price point because they are unaffordable for 95% of the people that live there. So as you know, in the free market, if it's not selling at a certain price, eventually the developer is going to be forced to lower that price until it's at such a point where people can actually afford it and want to enter the market. Which, if you have been talking about, as we have, and every politician of every political stripe claims to have been talking about it, care about affordable housing, that should be your ultimate goal, for the housing market to moderate to a point where people can actually afford to live in cities that they grew up in.
Well, this is what when the market performs, it will clear those houses at a reasonable cost. But
like what we talked about, we wanted to build more housing units in Canada, and part of the reason is not just to have units for people to live in, but so that the price can moderate and come down by creating more supply. So that first part of that, the conditions have been met in Vancouver, where you have this increase in supply, but now instead of allowing the prices to moderate and come down, because that would mean a bunch of large developers who are billionaires who have made billions over the past 10 and 20 years off the real estate market in Vancouver, rather than have those prices moderate and potentially they might have to take some losses, the government is coming here using taxpayer money for $1 billion bailout, spending $1.45 billion to basically buy up more than 2,000 condo units, rather than having the developers having to lower the prices and having people to be able to then enter the market at something that they can afford. So it is a bailout for big developers rather than just letting the prices fall and moderate as they should. And I just think it's so incredibly insulting to young people, to people that are trying desperately to enter the housing market, that instead of just letting the prices fall organically to a more moderate level, the government is actually taking their taxpayer money and giving it to the very same developers who have made billions over the past 20 years.
Absolutely. And also the banks that staked on them as well, because there's to develop condo development, you need to get that bridge financing.
It's a bailout of everyone behind the so it's the developers, it's the investors, some of which, by the way, aren't Canadian, so foreign investors, and big banks that bank them, and
that made all the money though on the upswing, and now where prices are starting to moderate, as we said, where people may start to buy them so that they can live in them. It's simply providing that floor, and that's not going to make for more affordable housing.
No, and it's the worst possible kind of iteration that you can imagine of what's known as crony capitalism, basically privatizing the profits. You take the risk and you make money, you get to keep it, but then socializing the losses, where you took the risk, you lose money, the government's going to give you the money anyways and take from all of the everyday hardworking Canadians instead. And the other concerning thing, as you mentioned, now being overseeing ethics and accountable government, is the fact that let's not mince words here. Many of these large developers in Vancouver are also massive Liberal Party donors. They have held and attended many fundraisers for both Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney over the past few years, and maybe even more directly, the Minister of Housing in this federal Liberal government, Gregor Robertson, is the former mayor of Vancouver back when it was the Wild West of donations and people were throwing around tens of thousands of dollars, has close connections, is a close personal friend to one individual who is the chair. So not only a close former advisor of Gregor Robertson and friend, also the chair of the Liberal Party in British Columbia, the federal Liberal Party in BC. And then in addition to those two things, also happens to be chief of staff at ONI, one of the largest property development firms in Vancouver, who stands to benefit the most from this condo bailout. So, and of course, that's just one example. So the potential, and the other thing that gets me is, where did this idea come from?
Well,
you remember it being discussed in the election? We want to bail out condo developers using taxpayer money?
No, and I also heard an interview with the Urban Development Institute of Vancouver, and they said this was not our ask of government. Same with the Canadian Home Builders Association. They weren't asking for this. So When you say there's these ongoing connections, and that totally explains why you, as the ethics critic, would be asking for some accountability.
And everybody's pointing, Mark Carney and David Eby kind of came out at this trotted out at this press conference with this idea that obviously landed completely flat, although they refuse to back away from it. But they're also kind of pointing fingers at each other about whose idea was it. And because it wasn't discussed in the election, it raises very serious ethical questions about where did this idea come from, who lobbied for it, and who stands to benefit the most. And, are those people that happen to make large max donations to the Liberal Party who had little, pull-aside conversations with Gregor Robertson or Mark Carney, and just how much are they benefiting from taxpayer money? And again, this is in the context of us running the largest deficit federally outside of COVID, the largest deficit in BC's history in British Columbia by a massive margin. And now we're going to borrow more money on the backs of taxpayers to give to these wealthy real estate tycoon billionaires because they might lose a little bit of money on a project. And by the way, not only is it, I think, a gross misuse of taxpayer money, it's also counterproductive to one of the government's own stated public policy objectives, which is to make housing more affordable.
Well, yeah, and this is what gets me in the Okanagan. And I heard this from the former MLA Dan Ashton in the Penticton area. BC Housing had a 600 plus unit development that they've gone through the local council with. And it's been now repaced and it's not proceeding. So you have where there's people with special needs and disabilities and really vulnerable people that you think that the NDP would be putting first. And essentially that project's off and suddenly this project is on.
And that's a project to create
affordable housing, like to actually create social housing for individuals that require it,
where there's no housing pursuit. Because the other thing about this is it's $1.45 billion in taxpayer money. Doesn't actually create any units of housing. That the units are already there.
Yes.
Eventually, the developers will be forced to lower the price, and then people will move into those units of housing. And instead, they're taking that away from, as you pointed out, areas where they could genuinely create more units of housing for people that are struggling with disabilities or other, or maybe one of these great recovery facilities.
Yeah, and then it makes no sense. Now, another area that I know that you've been intimately aware of, because we worked together on the Transportation Committee on this, where it makes absolutely no sense from the federal government to the provincial government, is the procurement of 4 vessels from a hybrid civilian defense shipyard in China. And I know you've been very outspoken because there's individuals in your riding that believe, just as there are in mine, and right across British Columbia, that these ferries should be built here in Canada. We've done them before. We've had excellent work. Just previous to the 90s, there's a number of ships that are still sailing today that were made right here in British Columbia. So that seems to be inconsistent because Mark Carney says buy Canadian. David Eby says we should be, supporting local, and yet we're sending taxpayer-funded loans to China. So maybe if you could talk about some of the hearings that we did and some of the things that you've been hearing, because your riding specifically has a lot of maritime and ferry workers.
Yeah, well, that committee hearing that you're talking about was my first time ever at committee. I was sitting next to Dan Albus, and I would have had it any other way. I can't remember if Gregor Robertson was first or the CEO of BC Ferries, because we had the 2 hours that day in the middle of summer, which I remember very, very fondly, very well. I was excited. I was also a little bit nervous, and I appreciate, again, your counsel before that. But, it's hard to think of something more ridiculous than using taxpayer money to subsidize the construction of a strategic asset, which is what shipbuilding is, in a state-owned shipyard in a communist adversarial country, which is what this government has decided to do in a context to build Canada strong. At least not what the Liberals campaigned on in the election. And, we toured, I believe we were together at C-SPAN in Vancouver. And the other thing is the government tries to make it seem like this need for new ferries just fell out of the sky. The ferries that they're replacing are something like 40, 50 years old. They've known for years and decades about what the lifespan of these ferries are. There's no reason why the government couldn't have come up with a strategic plan to replace them. And then to actually go and use taxpayer-funded, below market interest rate loans to subsidize this Chinese shipyard to build these ferries. In a state-owned shipyard in China, the Chinese are strategically subsidizing because it has dual military and civilian capabilities, is in the context of obviously the ongoing conversations about the Taiwanese Strait and Chinese ambitions there. It's so ludicrous, it's so incredibly short-sighted, and it's just incredibly disappointing when there's no reason why we couldn't have built those ships right here in British Columbia and right here in Canada.
No, I know also you've been listening to your constituents because there's some concerns around a federal program called reciprocal arrangements, and that's been put together by Transport Canada. I know you've put forward an e-petition petitioning the government on this. So could you maybe just tell us a little bit about what has your constituents concerned and why this particular reciprocal arrangements, is causing them, to go to their member of parliament?
Yeah, well, what it is, and you'll see the government do this in all sorts of different policy files, is they'll dress up certain policies with fancy language that doesn't adequately describe what's going on. What these are is it's a backdoor temporary foreign worker program. They call it reciprocal agreements, where you're basically going to recognize a worker's credentials from a different country and allow them to come directly to Canada and basically start working, rather than training those people for those jobs, training Canadians and using Canadians to fill those jobs right here in Canada. And of course, the idea of a reciprocal agreement with a country like Sri Lanka is kind of ridiculous, because I don't think there's any Canadians moving to Sri Lanka to work in these fields. It's a one-way pipeline, as it were. And what it's doing is the training in these countries isn't the same as it is here in Canada. And I've been told over and over again about safety issues, particularly on the Quadra Island Campbell River route, for example. People that have insufficient English language skills, which is what you need to use to communicate. And also the fact that BC Ferries is using this program to basically, instead of doing what they've done for decades otherwise, which is actually invest in their own workforce and train people from within to develop new skill sets and fill these positions here at home. And so that's why we started this petition. I should say I sponsored the petition, because it was people within my riding who work at BC Ferries that brought this to my attention. And from that union, and I'm more than happy to sponsor it and continue to work with them on this. And by the way, you've been a huge wealth of knowledge on this, so I'm sure I left some aspects of it out.
No, I think you've encapsulated there. But I think one of the things people need to know is that, governments oftentimes are given incredible powers, and how they dress things up. Like we're trying to find more affordable housing for people, which it ends up being a bailout for the condo development communities that are well connected, or where we need these ferries, and rather than try to work with industry right here in Canada, they just simply write it in such a way that no shipyard could possibly win it. In fact, we actually heard multiple times that other Chinese shipyards came second and third in that contest. So they're obviously going for the cheapest price. And now, instead of training Canadians and allowing them to take those senior positions to captain a vessel, they're basically putting a ceiling on how high a Canadian can go. And this is happening quietly, like you said. There's no application process. So it's very frustrating, especially when you're trying to represent a community like yours. Now, one area that I just want to get in to talk about my community here is because I have a lot of very skilled fishers who love recreational salmon harvesting, and they play by the rules. And I know that you've been on a committee that's been analyzing what the federal government has been doing through fisheries and oceans. Could you just maybe give us, in a nutshell, what the issue is with the salmon allocation of what the government's doing, what they're not doing, and why it seems so patently unfair to fishers in my area.
Yeah, well, what they're doing with the salmon allocation policy review, and it's similar to the impacts they've had on commercial fishermen with 30 by 30, is they're creating a huge amount of uncertainty by putting into jeopardy what's known as the priority access to Chinook and coho salmon along the coast. When you ask people what exactly does this mean, the short answer is nobody knows, and that's the problem. You know, a public fishery has been a core tenet of, and public access to that resource has been a core tenet of the West, literally going back to like the Magna Carta, as we know Pierre likes to go back and chat about on occasion. And so this has been so imagine being so how this translates to the real world. If you imagine like a recreational sports fishing guiding company on the coast, up in Port Hardy, down in Ucluelet on the coast, up in Bella Bella, anything like that. You know, there's only people want to come and fish when they can retain those fish through retention. And by having the priority for Chinook and coho salmon, which are incredibly valuable salmon for the sports fishing sector, they obviously need some predictability and certainty from when those retention periods are going to be. And with the salmon allocation policy review, nobody now knows whether you're going to be able to have predictable, sustained access to that fishery. So that's where that's what that policy means, and why it's creating so much frustration and concern. And of course, like so many things, and forestry is a perfect example, you can't look at the salmon allocation policy as just some kind of isolated effect on the rec sector. You got to look at it combined with 30-30, where the government is saying they want to close up to 30%, probably in British Columbia up to 40% of BC's coastal waters to various forms of fishing. You have to look at it with these crazy ideological policies that environmental groups are pushing and the government has been considering to supposedly protect killer whales that aren't evidence or science-based at all, that would again create further areas that restrict recreational fishing. You have to look at it with delayed decision-making when you had almost a near-record sockeye run last summer, and both commercial and recreational fishermen weren't allowed to go and fish up until the last possible second, leading to huge missed fishing opportunities, huge missed economic opportunities for reasons that nobody really knows. And all of this basically means is that it's just harder today to be a commercial or recreational fisherman than probably ever before.
Well, you said something really important here, is that there seems to be a different approach where the asset of the salmon, of fisheries, those are really on behalf of Canadians. The government looks after them. And the same goes with, I think you were mentioning forestry. You know, traditionally, BC has been a forestry led province where we've had tremendous amount of jobs and communities have sprung up around the forestry industry. And I see forestry companies from British Columbia. They're not leaving forestry, but they are leaving British Columbia, and they're going to other jurisdictions. Yeah. I know that this issue about forestry also touches your riding, and you've been doing some investigation. Can you maybe just give my viewers just a snapshot of what you're seeing and hearing?
Well, the forest industry in BC is on the brink of collapse. And, the federal government, I just had a forestry roundtable yesterday over in Vernon. The NDP and the Liberal government are just using the excuse of the United States to try to explain away all the problems that the industry is facing here. When you sit down with forestry companies and forestry workers, it's a concern. It's making the problem worse. The tariff issue is not even in the top 3 of the issues facing the sector right now. And actually, if you look at the health of the Alberta sector, forestry sector, which you don't really think of when you think of forestry, it's doing much better comparatively than here in British Columbia. And that is because of policy after policy that has restricted access to fiber. And that again, there's concerns around 30 by 30, so that also includes shutting out 30% of BC's land base. There are concerns where permits that used to take weeks are now taking months. The ones that took months now take years. There's land uncertainty created with DRIPA and UNDRIP, and people having no idea what's going on with where they have to get approval from to be able to access the land base. There are concerns about these old growth management areas that was completely ideologically pushed. You have old growth management areas that have been set up where we're not allowed to go log in ecosystems in the interior that are fire ecosystems. Literally, by not logging these areas, you're just creating like a tinderbox and waiting for a fire to start and burn it all down, rather than harvesting it sustainably and responsibly. Look, forestry, it's one of these things where we have the knowledge and the capacity and the skills to do this sustainably. We could do it for 1 million years, harvesting forest here in British Columbia, replant the forest. In British Columbia, we have forest that we're cutting down for the third time because it grows so fast. And instead, what's happening is it's become so uneconomical to do business in BC. All of these large companies are taking the billions of dollars they've made, and instead of reinvesting here, they're looking far afield, going to the US, going to other countries, and investing there instead. And I think it's a complete shame. And thousands of people have lost their jobs. More than 10 coastal mills have closed over the past 7 years. And I hate to see an industry that in so many ways helped build this province basically reduced to a fraction of what it used to be. And the environmentalists try to make it seem that, and I hate using the word environmentalist because I think we're all environmentalists that live in BC, but the radical ideologues make it seem like we've somehow ran out of trees here in British Columbia, and that is so far from the truth. It's ridiculous. And we have some of the highest environmental standards in the world, and I think like forestry, like mining, like oil and gas, as long as the world needs these resources, what better place to get them than from right here in Canada?
Absolutely, and supporting British Columbia and Canadian workers. That needs to happen. Well, Aaron, we've gone through a lot of things today. Let me just first of all thank you again for sharing your expertise with us, because you just went through drug policy, talked a little bit about the economic and ethical issues around bailouts for condo developers, all the way talking about reciprocal arrangements and BC ferries, and I know because your riding heavily depends on it. Thank you for just being a voice where you get in, you see what is working, what isn't working, and you call it out. I look forward to working with you on solutions to all of these things. But sometimes I think government just needs to step back and maybe listen more, because on all these things, whether we're talking about our forestry, whether we're talking about listening to our workers about creating ferries, we can do this, but we need to listen more. Anyway, thank you again for coming on Finding Solutions, and I look forward to seeing what you do next with your new promotion as the Shadow Minister for Ethics. All the best in that. So folks, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Finding Solutions. It was an incredible amount of topics we hit today, and we'll keep inviting individuals who have as much to say and as eloquently as Aaron Gunn. So we'll see you on another episode of Finding Solution. I'm Dan Elvis. Thanks so much for watching.